cis thing does many things. So to return to the previous thing, I mean, so on the one hand you have a movement to undermine the political category of women, right? And what that is then doing is splitting the capacity to articulate the political interests of women, right? Now, there are many fault lines with it, because women are half the population and oppressed half of the population. We are cut through with all of the other axes, right? So it is clearly the case that the political interests of black women and the political interests of disabled women and the political interests of working class women are not all completely identical in all instances. We all have an interest in not being raped, for example. We all have an interest in reproductive justice. Feminism generally tends to organise, or has historically organised around sets of issues which impact the whole class, and then there has also been a historical practice of various subgroups organising within that. So black feminism as its own entity happened right at the beginning of the second wave, very, very, very early, because obviously the black women were like, okay, well, we actually have very different lived experience from these white women, so we're going to go over here and we're going to organise around our particular set of interests as black women, but still within a general system of the analysis of patriarchy. So that's the first thing, and undoing that is very problematic.
How does the cis thing come into that?
The cis thing comes into it because what it does is it posits women. The function of the cis trans binary is to flip the axis of oppression. Right? So
because trans women become oppressed by cis women.
So because trans women are oppressed by cis women, the cis trans binary flips the axis of oppression and it nullifies women's political claims. It's incredibly dangerous in that respect, because firstly, like I say, you've got a movement that is breaking the identification of women as a political class and the articulation of their political interests, and simultaneously you've got a discourse that is positing the articulation of women's political interests as the articulation of the dominant discourse, and hence nullifies women's political claims. And this comes back to where you have a problem with the analysis of reality, of where reality is useful, right? Is that, and also the crucial issue here from a second wave perspective in the relationship between second and third wave feminism is that you have to have an analysis of the motivation of patriarchal oppression, right? It's a material form of oppression. There are only three axes of oppression: race, class, and sex, right? Because those are forms in which you have one class over another class.
What about disability, sexual orientation?
Those are discriminations.
Okay, so there's a difference between oppression and discrimination.
Because non-disabled people are not invested in the extraction of resources from disabled people as a class. Right. So there are, and this is not to say that there's not a hierarchy of value in terms of, it's not that being oppressed is worse than being discriminated against. Both discriminations and oppressions are systems of limitation, right? Being discriminated against will profoundly limit you in a way that is equally damaging to your flourishing as an individual, because it doesn't matter whether your limitation is coming from an oppression or a discrimination in terms of it being a limitation. What matters is what the resistance is to the removal of that limitation, right? In cases of oppression, there is a material, structural reason for that limitation being in place. In the case of disabled people, access, for example, there is a material reason for that, but it's not because we need to maintain that, and if we don't maintain that, it's going to screw the system of economic exploitation up in some
exactly
way.
I mean, if it was possible, if we suddenly had £1 million and we could put ramps in everywhere, no one's going to be going,
no one's going to stop it,
right? No one's going to be losing their power
whereas men being invested in the control of women's reproductive labour that's a thing, right? Like, moving that is much more difficult. If it's not like we could just get... In discriminations, there's issues of resource allocation and who's considered to be important, but there's not necessarily like a structural force pushing against it, right? In the case of racial discrimination, you both have a material force, but you also, I mean, you have a very powerful sovereignty logic, right? And concepts of superiority and stuff. So there is a... Historically, there's a material reason, right? And then that has now fed out into...
So you're talking about colonialism was the original reason for that oppression?
Colonialism, slavery, the exploitation, the commodification of black bodies.
And now we're looking at the aftermath
and now we're looking at the aftermath of that, but it was historically a form of oppression. We could argue that it has now... The material reason for the oppression doesn't exist.
So it's discrimination now, you could argue that, yeah?
But I would argue that because it was historically a form of oppression, that the structure that is built around it in terms of the othering structure, right, and the dehumanizing structure that was required, particularly in the case of America, in order to maintain that degree of human rights violation on their soil, the structure you had to build to leverage it was so enormous that, and the wound is so deep. So, I mean, it's a slightly different case in terms of America because that's such a foundational wound. It may be the case that there is now no material desire for exploitation that's maintaining the structure, but because there was, and it was built with such force, it's very hard to remove.
Okay.
They have slightly different, but I mean, this is why the first three are materially motivated systems.
So we had race, sex, and
class.
Class, right.
So, for example, the discrimination against homosexuals isn't a form of oppression, right? It's a form of discrimination, and it's a discrimination that grows out of... Most gay men I know, and lesbians as well, will recognise that their oppression or their discrimination is a kind of offshoot of patriarchy. Right? So patriarchy produces ideas of heteronormativity and correct gender roles and gender conformativity, correct gender conforming.
Oh, I see. Right, men that don't conform get given a hard time, and that's the origin of that discrimination.
Yes, I mean, because the construction of patriarchal masculinity includes the repudiation of the feminine is such a fundamental part of the structure of patriarchal masculinity. Lesbians, the discrimination against lesbians and the discrimination against gay men is actually quite different in its modality.
Yeah.
There's different things going on with that, but I mean, they're both formed by the structure of patriarchal masculinity and patriarchal femininity, and the way in which deviations from that have been punished historically. And I mean, women are punished particularly for not being male focused. Hello, that seems to still be going on. But women who are not invested in patriarchal approval are quite threatening because they're free, and that's not liked generally. So it's very important when you're talking about these types of things to recognise whether something is an oppression or a discrimination, because it tells you a lot about who's benefiting and what investments there are in maintaining certain structures. It's not, like I say, it's not a judgment about the effect it has on people's lives.
Yes, it's not like, oh, I'm oppressed and you're just discriminated against.
No, it's not that at all. It's not that at all.
But it's actually